I waited all day. It was hot, unusually hot for early autumn, but the papers remained soaked. It was no use. I carefully folded them and placed them in the pocket of my dress. I began to climb back up the hill toward the house, which was just barely visible in the distance, but I stopped. I didn't want to go back there. There was nothing left for me there. I stood and waited for some kind of sign. The trees to the east seemed to be calling to me, so I went east and entered the forest at nightfall. The moon was just under full and cast a cold, dim light through the trees. I could just barely make out their shapes in the darkness. I stumbled over roots and fallen branches until I found a path. It led east, to the part of the forest Blade and I had explored so thoroughly. I couldn't continue. My body was exhausted, and I decided to find a place to sleep for the night. I wasn't ready to go back there and face the memories. There was a boulder just off the path. It jutted out of the ground at an angle, forming a hollow space beneath it. The hollow was filled with dead leaves and was snug and dry. I wrapped my cloak around me and spoke a simple warming spell. My father may have been evil, but his machine had certainly worked. I found my new knowledge a little overwhelming and was always surprised when a spell would come to mind, solving whatever problem I had. Warm and snug in the hollow, I allowed myself to drift off to sleep. I was not afraid as I fell asleep. There was no threat from the woods or the creatures living there. The only fear I had was of what lay ahead. I woke before dawn, freezing and covered in dew. I said the warming spell again and rubbed my hands together. The night was beginning to lift, leaving the forest shrouded in a heavy fog. All around me, fairies fluttered, spreading dew and playing in the mist. Given all that had happened, this was not as shocking as it once would have been. The fairies were very pretty, but a bit standoffish. They pointedly ignored me and continued with their play. I crawled out of my den and stretched. Sleeping in a hollow under a rock had been a far more uncomfortable experience than I had expected, and my joints were aching. I started to walk down the path, hoping the movement would warm me and take away some of the stiffness. I did not fear my destination any longer. My mother had been in my dreams, and she told me not to be afraid. She told me I was strong and my choices were good, though they would not always be right. She believed I would be strong enough to overcome any hardship and to see the way with eyes of opportunity. I couldn't help smiling as I remembered it. It was a moment I had always wanted, a mother-daughter chat. It wasn't long before the trees began to look familiar, and the path I was following joined the main route behind the two houses. I turned and looked through the trees. Our house was just barely discernible through the leaves. I couldn't go back, and even as this thought entered my mind, there was a rumble far underground. The trees trembled violently, snapping branches as they clashed together. I ran toward the house and arrived just in time to watch it sink. The ground opened up beneath it, and it was gone. A heavy silence fell as the shaking stopped. I stood staring at the place where the house had been. Now there was no choice. I went back into the forest and walked toward Blade's house. I started to run. I didn't want to wait any longer. The house came into view and I ran faster. I burst out of the trees and terrified Blade's mother. She screamed and jumped back. She had been trimming the grass around a tree close to their house when I emerged. She threw her gloves in the air and flung the trimmers at me. I dodged them, and then she recognized me. Her face immediately went back to the placid, contented face she wore around her children, an expression that told me she had checked out and was not paying any attention to what was actually being said. "Oh, hello, Casey. You scared me half to death. Blade and Evelyn aren't home right now. Maybe you could come back later." "Actually, Mrs. Connor, I just wanted to go explore the pine forest behind your house." I hadn't known where I was going until I said it. Her expression didn't change. Her thoughts were already elsewhere. She shrugged her shoulders slowly. "If you really want to, go ahead. I've never understood what the big deal was about a bunch of trees." She went inside the house. Through the kitchen window, I could see her making iced tea, and the air smelled of freshly baked cookies. Some things did not change. Some things went on forever, always following the same routine. It was comforting somehow. I could see why they had chosen to live with her. and take on the roles of her children. She was soothingly simple. I turned away with a longing in my heart, but my mother was amongst the pine trees, not presiding over an oven. I entered their fragrant temple eagerly. This place gave me a feeling of being home, of protection and peace. It was my mother's shrine, her secret place of power and strength. I knelt and bowed my head, offering a prayer to my mother's spirit and asking her to bless and watch over me. Her presence surrounded me, and I felt happier than I ever had been. I felt loved. There was no path in these trees, so I wandered aimlessly, moving with my emotions, following my heart and trusting my mother to guide me. After some time, I came upon a clearing in the middle of a thick ring of trees. The ground was flat and carpeted with a layer of pine needles the color of rust. That was all there was. I moved slowly around the clearing, searching for a sign, a broken branch, or a stray pebble, but I couldn't find anything. I sat down on the roots of the nearest tree and waited. A soft wind began to stir the treetops and sing through the branches. I recognized the tune. It was another lullaby, one my mother had sang to me every night before bed. I hadn't thought about it in years. My heart swelled with love, and tears ran down my cheeks. With a creak, the tree next to me lifted its roots. Something underneath glittered, and I pulled out several jewels, each one larger than the palm of my hand. The colors were deep and rich, and the gems sparkled in the daylight. The jewels of Nakai. I spoke quietly, and the wind carried my words up into the trees. The story of Bentley Dale was true. Clara had been the witch he loved. She must have stolen the jewels and buried them here soon after their arrival in Crystal River. But what about the child? There was a little girl in that story. It couldn't be me. The age didn't work out right. I slipped the jewels into my pockets. My dress was growing heavy. Each pocket now held some kind of magical trinket. I went into the trees and gathered twigs and dead branches to make a fire. I sat close to the flames, holding up my mother's letters, one sheet at a time. But nothing worked. They remained soaking wet and blank. I felt cheated. I was a fool. The late queen had used me to settle a score with Duma, and she had used my mother as bait. I balled up the soggy parchments and tossed them into the fire. The explosion sent me flying back into the trees, and a column of sparks shot straight into the air. They rained down on me, scorched my dress, and singed my hair. I ran for cover. The fire popped a few more times, shooting the letters into the air. They floated gracefully down to the ground and lay in a pile next to the fire, which had shrunk back to its original size. I moved cautiously forward. I was wary of a second round of explosions, but eager to see the pages. There was writing on them. I could see it from across the clearing. The first was a letter from my mother. My hand shook as I tried to read through the tears in my eyes. Dear Casey, I'm not sure how to begin a letter like this, so I hope you will forgive the bluntness of my approach. There is so much I wish to tell you, so much I wish I could explain. But this task is not about me. It is about the fate of our people. Instructions. Use the blue jewel to reach the ocean. Hold it tight in your hand and concentrate. It will take you to the Panush village. The people there distrust strangers, but I hope you will find someone to help you. You will need to find a boat. Norg Hollow lies in the south, near what is known in this world as Antarctica. Do not fear. It is not deadly cold where you are going. You will cross the portal before you go too far south, and cross into the magic realm, where Norg Hollow lies. The yellow jewel will help you find true south. Crack it open. My compass lies within. The one you have is a fake. I didn't want the last remaining compass to fall into the wrong hands, so I hid this one with the jewels just after you were born. It will show you the way. Just keep moving south. On your way, keep your eyes open for another young witch. Her name is Meloda. She is your older sister. She went in search of Norg Hollow with your uncle, and they never returned. I hope you will meet her during your journey. The two of you could bring Norg Hollow back to the power it once had, and restore honor to the witches. I wish there was more I could tell you, but this is all the information I have. Saving the witches was never my role. It is yours. I believe in you, Casey. I wish you a safe journey. Love, your mother. The other pages were filled with nonsensical words and symbols. It didn't make any sense to me, so I pocketed the papers and took out the yellow gem. I wanted to open it and look at the compass, but there was nothing I could use to crack it. I put it back in my pocket and found the blue jewel. I clasped it tightly in my hand and tried to think about the ocean. I had seen the ocean only once before, on a school trip in 3rd grade. We went to study marine life along the shore, but I didn't pay attention to any of it. I couldn't stop staring at the water. I was fixated. The roar of the waves was a siren song. I knew the ocean was speaking to me, and I felt that if I could just listen a little closer, I would start to hear the words within the roar. My teacher pulled me aside just as I had decided to move in closer. My toes had just barely touched the water when she asked to see my drawings of the creatures we were supposed to be observing. The spell was broken, and after receiving a lecture about taking full advantage of this precious learning experience, I followed my class back to the bus. I had not seen the ocean since, but it called to me constantly. I dreamed of it often, and had even heard the call of the waves during the daytime. The jewel glowed hot in my hand, but I held on, remembering the fresh, salty smell of the air and the cool, moist sand at the water's edge. I was there, surrounded by the water, the rush of the tide, and the taste of the spray. Everything around me went gray. I was swept into a thick mist, and as it faded, I found myself standing on a beach. The wind was in my face. The water rolled gently over my toes and rushed back out again. The air was filled with the sounds of seagulls and children laughing in the distance. I turned to look at the village behind me. Small, weather-beaten houses lined the beach. In front of each was a long deck with a light at the end. Many of the villagers were outside. The men were working on their boats, bringing in their catch after a long day. The women were hanging wash or watching the children run around the beach and yelling every so often when one of the smaller children strayed toward the sea. I had hoped to arrive unnoticed, but every eye in the village was on me, and many of the faces did not look friendly. I was trying to decide what to do next when a large woman in denim overalls stepped forward and welcomed me in a booming voice to the Panouche village. The other villagers bowed in welcome, and I was escorted to the local inn. The villagers made a fuss over my comfort and then left me as quickly as possible. They all wore smug, satisfied expressions, as if they had done a noble deed by being kind to the stranger on their beach. I crossed the room and looked in the mirror. I barely recognized myself. The weeks of stress and long days without food or sleep had taken their toll. My arms were white sticks hidden in the billowing sleeves of my dress, and there were dark circles under my eyes. My cheeks were hollows and accentuated the delicate bones of my face. I surveyed the tiny room. There was a bed, a dresser, and a chair. The small door to the bathroom stood partially open. The woman in overalls had turned the light on for me, as if I was incapable of finding it without her help. I didn't like this village. Their fake friendliness was far worse than the stares and whispers of Crystal River. I looked forward to the morning and getting out of Panouche village as quickly as possible. My window faced the ocean and opened onto a small terrace. I stood there, staring out at the sea, and trying to guess where Norg Hollow lay in relation to my hotel. I thought again of the jewels and felt my pockets. They were still there. I surveyed the row of boats lining the shore. More were docking as the fishermen returned for the night. My eye was drawn to a large ship that had just docked. There was a boy on the ship. He was tall and thin, and his skin was brown from years of hard work in the sun. His hair was black and hung in his eyes. He must have sensed me watching him. He looked up and caught my eye briefly before I turned away in embarrassment. I went quickly into my room and shut the window. I took out the jewels and laid them on the bed. The yellow gem gleamed in the dim light of the table lamp. I picked it up and looked at it closely. I could see something inside. The real compass. I looked around for something to smash the gem, but there was nothing. There was a loud knock at the door. I jumped up and quickly hid the jewels in my pockets. I ran to the door and peered through the peephole. I couldn't see anyone out in the hall, but when I looked down, I saw a folded piece of paper at my feet. I picked it up with shaking fingers and opened it. Meet us at 8 a.m. The Hungry Sailor. 2 lines and nothing else. I folded the note and opened the door. The hall was empty. I quickly shut the door and slid the deadbolt. Though I had always felt very alone, I had never actually been by myself. Valencia had always been just a few rooms away, and a new wave of fear washed over me and made my heart pound in my ears. I didn't like this cryptic message. There was no way of knowing who wrote it, or their intent. I knew I would go to the meeting. I didn't have another option, and I wanted to get out of Panouche Village as quickly as possible. I had seen the restaurant on my way to the inn. It was right next door. The rest of the evening passed slowly. I had nothing to do but think about everything that had happened and what lay in store for me. I ordered room service, which was surprisingly good, but the loneliest meal I had ever eaten. I couldn't stay locked up any longer, and after dinner decided to venture out into the village. I got quite a few strange looks as I walked down the street. There were many false smiles, followed by tense silences, until I had passed from view. But the beauty of the land made up for the unfriendliness of its people. It was breathtaking. I walked down the beach and into the surf. The waves rushed against my legs, and I closed my eyes and felt the sun and the spray on my face. The constant crash of the ocean drowned out the worries in my mind. When I opened my eyes, I saw that I was no longer alone. The boy I had seen earlier was standing a few feet away with his hands in his pockets, and his face turned toward the sea. His eyes were closed, and the corner of his mouth turned up in a small smile. The fading sun was on his face, and the wind sent his hair rippling like a flag behind him. He turned and looked at me suddenly. His eyes were bright blue. He smiled at me before turning and starting back toward the beach. As I watched him walk away, I noticed a man standing on the beach watching us. His hair was black and fell to his waist. His skin was brown and leathery from years of working in the sun. He had his arms folded across his chest, and he didn't look pleased. The boy joined him and they walked away quickly. The man was saying something and glancing back at me. His face was angry, and he gestured wildly with his hands as he spoke. The boy turned and looked back at me. He was still smiling. The sun was setting and had turned the sky a brilliant shade of orange. I hurried back to the inn, regretting that I had left the safety of my room. I couldn't get the boy's strange smile out of my mind, but the angry man with him made me nervous. I went to bed, hoping to stop my thoughts just long enough to get some rest. I was exhausted, but sleep would not come. I tossed and turned until dawn broke. I washed and dressed and went down to the beach to watch the fishermen depart. I had a few hours until my meeting, and the ocean called to me. I couldn't wait to get out there. I was used to living away from people, and the village and all of its watching eyes felt confining. I again looked forward to leaving Panouche Village. Everyone in the village was wearing jeans and t-shirts or sweatshirts, and I felt like a freak walking around dressed all in black. I needed to find a ship that would take me south, but most of the fishermen pointedly ignored me as they loaded their boats. They moved quickly, probably working faster than usual to get away before I spoke to them. Some of the wives came down to the pier to talk to their husbands and cast suspicious looks in my direction. I couldn't bring myself to speak to any of them, so I left the beach and began walking along the street. Past the row of buildings that lined the shore, the road ran west along the edge of a cliff that dropped straight down into the sea. The waves roared and crashed against the rock wall, and the road climbed steeply up into the foothills. I was halfway up the first hill and taking a break from the grueling climb when I saw them. The boy smiled when he saw me and said something to the man beside him. The man smiled grimly, and they continued their steady pace down the hill. I expected them to pass without a word, so I was surprised when they stopped beside me. The man looked around nervously, and the boy smiled. I was surprised to find myself blushing. "You were supposed to meet us at the Hungry Sailor," the man said. "Perhaps it's better this way. Less people will notice. Discretion is very important always. Remember this." "Who are you?" "I am called by many names. Here I am known as Humbird. I own a ship, which I believe you saw yesterday, and would like to offer my services to you on your journey." "What journey?" Humbird smiled. It transformed his face, making him appear far more handsome and friendly. He laughed. You are right to be cautious, but you need not fear me. My son and I are here to serve and protect you. We wish to assist the last witch of Norg Hollow in any way we can. They both laughed at my surprised expression. Mistress Lucia, the Queen of Lychee, is a good friend of mine and asked me to help you. She knew you would come here, but we were surprised to see you so soon. We were walking together down the hill. The boy still had not said a word. I didn't even know his name. He just walked silently beside me and smiled whenever I turned my head slightly to look at him. Humbird was quiet as we walked, and I was grateful for the silence. There were too many questions crowding my thoughts, but I didn't dare to ask any of them. When we reached the docks, the village was quiet. Most of the fishermen had already left for the day, and the women and children were inside having breakfast. Humbird showed me a board and sent the boy to a nearby store for provisions. He had loaded most of the supplies the night before and was anxious to leave. The boy returned, and he untied the ropes holding the boat to the dock. As we floated away from land, leaving the village behind, I could see the villagers gathering on the beach. Nothing went unnoticed in Panush village. Chapter 13. The feeling I had when the Panush village disappeared from view, and there was no land left, was a mixture of absolute freedom and immense terror. It was scary, but also thrilling. The rolling of the waves and the vastness of the slate-gray sea sent my head spinning, but I was awake. The cold spray was in my face, and I felt ready for anything. I saw the boy approaching, and I smiled. I had not seen either of my new acquaintances all morning. I caught a brief glimpse of them working, as I wandered around the boat and tried to get acclimated to my new home. He bowed low and then swiped his hair out of his eyes. Join us for lunch. My father would like to speak with you. He gave me a shy smile and walked away. I followed him to the galley. It was cramped and full of ancient, dirty equipment. Humbird was seated at a small table. He took a drink from a tin cup that sat in front of him. He seemed calmer and more comfortable now that we were out at sea. Welcome to the SS Grisman, Lady Casey. Now that we are away from prying eyes, allow me to properly introduce myself. I am Garrick, and this is my son, Monroe. We are Wizards of Greys. I believe you have heard of us. I nodded. Your great-grandfather was a most honorable wizard, and his passing was a painful shock to our entire ordinance. My grandfather spoke of him often. They were good friends. It is for this reason that I agreed to help you. He flexed his gnarled fingers and ran them over his long beard. Wizards usually keep to themselves. We do not meddle in the affairs of others, especially those of the witches. But the fate of our families is intertwined. We must help each other. I would like to see Norg Hollow return to the glory and power that it once possessed. He took another drink and stared into his cup. He tapped it loudly on the edge of the table and cleared his throat. You have defeated the Rasky King. No more will that enemy walk our lands. I am impressed. Your powers must be very strong. However, you have other enemies, groups that would not be pleased to see the return of the witches. I would like to offer you our services, mine and the boys. We will do everything in our power to protect you and aid in your quest for Norg Hollow. You have our lives. He knelt in the customary manner of the wizard's pledge. Monroe started to kneel beside him, but I stopped him. Wait, I will not take your life sworn from another's lips. If you wish to serve me, vow for yourself, or I will not accept your help. He smiled and took my hand. His touch sent a shock up my arm. I swear that for the rest of my long life, I will use all my powers to protect and serve you, no matter the consequences. He kissed my hand and knelt next to his father. I blessed them both and asked them to rise. We sat down to eat, and for a long time no one spoke. We concentrated on our food, and when we finished, Garrick sent Monroe back to work. I want to speak to you privately for a moment. It is about my son. Monroe is very special to me. He is a great wizard, and one day he will be one of our most honored, a Deku. It is the highest title a wizard can receive. It can only be achieved through rigorous self-discipline and intense study. He must not be distracted from his goal. Do you understand me? Not really.
His eyes were small and black. His forehead was creased with deep wrinkles. He grabbed my hand in his strong grip and stared into my eyes. His lip curled into a sneer and revealed a tarnished gold tooth. "Stay away from my son. He has a destiny, and you will not keep him from it." I stammered some sort of answer, and he shook my hand slowly, staring menacingly into my eyes. A chill ran through me. Garrick had a powerful body, and his penetrating eyes made me nervous. He had sworn his life to me, yet I couldn't help feeling that Garrick hated me. The day passed by slowly. I remained below deck until the sky finally grew dark and the stars came out. There were thousands of them. The enormity of the sky made me feel even more alone. The world was so big. Our ship was an insignificant speck in an endless ocean. There was nothing else for miles, and the only sounds were the sails snapping in the breeze and the clamor of the crew. As I stood staring out into the inky sky, I heard footsteps behind me. They stopped, and I turned to face Monroe. He smiled and bowed. "Everything's calm this evening. Would you like to come sit with me?" "I don't know. Are you done studying?" He laughed. "He gave you the 'stay away from my son' speech. Wow, that was fast. Everyone gets it at some point, and most people obey. He's an intimidating man. Aren't you afraid of my father?" "Should I be? He vowed himself to my service and protection. I agreed not to stand in the way of you and your destiny. I don't think talking to you is going to do that." Monroe smiled but didn't answer. I liked his smile. It was warm and inviting. He was a few years older than me, and only a little older than Blade. I was shocked to realize it was the first time I had thought about Blade since I left Crystal River. Garrick appeared from below deck, and we both jumped. He looked displeased, but did not say anything. He motioned for us to follow him, and we walked past the rest of the crew who were hauling in fishing nets and, hopefully, our next meal. We sat around a table in the galley, and Garrick spread out the map. It was actually 2 maps laid on top of each other. He pointed to a place where the 2 maps matched. "We're approaching this portal. We should be there before nightfall tomorrow. Once we have crossed into the magical realm, we will need you to guide us. Norg Hollow is hidden, and no one has been able to find it for many, many years. Can you do this?" I nodded and hoped that I could. "Good. Be on guard at all times. You never know what ill winds approach. Lady Casey, have you given much thought to what you will do when you find the land you seek?" "I haven't really thought about it. I never dreamed I'd get this far." "Well, you'd best give it some thought. You have a monumental task before you. It would be better if you were prepared." I nodded, though inside I didn't agree at all. I had no idea how to prepare for something like this. I didn't know what to expect or whom I might encounter. I didn't even have a complete grasp on the history of the witches, though it had improved immensely when Valencia transferred her powers to me. The task at hand was overwhelming, and thinking of it filled me with dread. One of the men called out to Garrick, and he left to inspect something tangled in the nets. Monroe reached across the table for my hand and squeezed it. "Don't let him scare you. Think of everything you have already achieved. My father likes to give orders, but he is not a wise man. Do what your instincts tell you. That is where magic thrives." He gave my hand another squeeze and looked like he might kiss me. I pulled my hand away. The men were shouting, and I hurried to see what was going on. Monroe followed, and we dodged in between the clusters of large bodies until we reached the front of the group. Tangled in the net at our feet, amidst the trapped and dying fish, was the body of a young woman. Her clothes were tattered black rags. She clutched her hands in front of her chest, as if holding something very dear to her, unable to give it up even at her moment of death. She had been badly beaten. Her body was battered and broken. Large purple bruises covered her skin, and her throat had been cut. Garrick pulled apart her hands, and a shell fell onto the deck. He picked it up and we gazed at it in wonder. It was unlike any I had ever seen. Our shells were white, or occasionally a very light pink. This shell was bright purple. "This is a shell from the shores of Norg Hollow. These are only found on a small beach in the golden lands of Almuda, the eastern lands. This woman came from Norg Hollow." Garrick looked at me darkly. "Do you know her?" I did. She was my sister, Meloda. I sat with her body through the long, cold night. The men removed her from the net as carefully as they could and covered her with a blanket. I sat on an overturned bucket near her body and held the shell tightly in my hand. There were so many questions, and I would never have the answers now that she was gone. She found it first. I wondered why she had left Norg Hollow. She should have remained and waited for me. Monroe brought me some food just before dawn. His eyes were red and underlined with dark, puffy circles. He didn't speak. He sat beside me and held my hand. We stayed that way until dawn broke over the horizon, and we heard his father stirring below. Monroe dropped my hand and jumped to his feet. I must go study, or my father will make me work on deck. Come find me in a few hours. I have something to show you. He vanished around the corner, and I was again left alone with my sister's body. Garrick appeared at my side. He stood stiffly with his hands clasped behind his back and looked out over the water as he spoke. I have prepared a place for the body until you perform the sending ceremony. I advise you to keep it quick and private. It is better that the men do not know who you are. Be very careful with whom you speak. Not everyone is a friend of the witches. He turned and briskly walked away while barking orders to his crew. I watched the sea. The sunlight caught the spray and cast bits of rainbows into the air. A school of dolphins appeared beside us. I watched with envy as they broke the surface of the water and dove again and again. Not long after, 2 rough, weather-beaten sailors came to move Meloda's body to the room Garrick had appointed below deck. The room contained a long table where they laid my sister's body and covered her with a tarp. Garrick had placed a cot in there with a thick, warm blanket and a pillow. There was some kindness underneath his rough exterior, after all. The sailors did their job quickly and silently. Garrick must have ordered them to keep their distance. This made me irrationally angry. I was tired of Garrick's rules. I was not used to living in silence. Valencia had always encouraged me to speak to people and learn their stories. She had been skilled at getting stories from even the most private people. Since most of the kids in Crystal River had ignored my friendly advances, I had never had a chance to try. The men of the crew fascinated me. I wanted to know about these people, and their stories could prove useful somewhere along the way. One of them might know what I was supposed to do if we found Norg Hollow, and I could use all the help I could get. I had no idea where to begin, and I needed to talk to someone. The silence was driving me mad. I still found the sailors a little too intimidating, so I decided to go find Monroe. I was curious to see what he wanted to show me. I found him hidden away in a remote corner below deck. He was seated at a small desk that was littered with papers and open books. He was so absorbed in what he was reading that he didn't notice me for several minutes. I cleared my throat and he jumped, dropping his book, and made a strange squeaky noise in the back of his throat. I laughed. He grinned back at me and tossed his hair out of his eyes. You surprised me. That's obvious, I said as I sat down across from him. On the table before me was a large book. It was open to a page with a drawing of a boat at sea. In the sky there was numerous symbols. Some I understood and some I did not. Monroe saw me looking and turned the book so I could see it better. It's a traditional sending ceremony for witches. It's written in the wizard language, but they're pretty similar. I can help you with this if you'd like. Thanks. I need all the help I can get. Some of this makes sense, but not everything. I've never seen a sending ceremony. I don't even know what one is. I have no idea what I'm doing. I stared silently at the page without really seeing it. Sudden tears threatened to spill, but I fought them back. I'm going to fail, Monroe. I have no idea where I'm going or what I'm supposed to do when I get there. The wrong witch died. I shouldn't be the last. I'm not ready. Monroe looked thoughtful and reached across the table to take my hand. He held it firmly in both of his, and I felt slightly less panicked. You have to be ready. Whether you want it or not, the responsibility is yours. You are the last of the mighty witches of Norg Hollow. I've been studying the history of the witches. It's fascinating. I would like to be of assistance. You will have all the help I can offer. Sword, brain, or anything else you may need. I am here for you. He squeezed my hand. I felt warm inside when he smiled, and I knew I would recover from the loss of my first love. I could suddenly see my obsession with Blade Connor for what it was, a crush on a bad boy who was absolutely wrong for me in every way. That his sister tried to kill me just made the recovery process that much faster. Monroe was completely different. He was studious and serious, but he had a playful side. His kindness was evident, and he had given his life to me. I felt comfortable around him. He was safe, and it was nice to feel safe. I hadn't truly felt that way since I met Blade and his little sister. Monroe and I were still smiling at each other when Garrick walked into the room. His rage was immediate, and I ran from the tidal wave of anger that he threw down upon his son. Monroe sat listening patiently to his father's uproar. There was a small smile on his lips and a sparkle of mischief in his eyes. He winked when he caught my eye, causing Garrick to wheel around and demand that I get above deck immediately. I complied. They stayed below deck a long time, and no one disturbed them. The sailors muttered something to each other, but they grew quiet when I approached. Finally, I went up to a large sailor named Sam, one of the strongest men on the crew and a natural leader. "What are your men saying? Is it about Monroe and Garrick?" Sam frowned at me. "We're not supposed to talk to you." "Why not?" He shrugged. "Boss don't want us to. We don't ask questions." "Maybe you should." He shook his head and laughed. "You think about what you're doing. I know who you are. Some of the others do too. There's a price on your head. Do you know that? Garrick has his reasons, and he is trying to keep you safe. Just keep your mouth shut." He started to leave and go back to work, but he stopped. "Stay away from Monroe. He's the one who will suffer if you don't." He walked away without another word. I didn't dare to ask any more questions. Some of the crew had been watching my conversation with Sam very carefully. I slipped away as quickly as I could and hid between a barrel and the wall. I still had a view of the door that led below deck, but the crew couldn't see me. Sam's parting words kept repeating in my head. I wasn't sure what he meant, but it didn't take long to find out. The door swung open, and Monroe limped out. His face was bloody and purple, and both eyes were almost swollen shut. 2 long cuts ran up the sides of his face and dripped blood onto his shoulders, making his shirt cling to him. He held his left arm cradled gently in his right hand, and I could see it was broken. I held in my scream. I was shaking with rage, but I listened to Sam's advice. I could not go near Monroe again. Garrick emerged a little while later. His face was satisfied, and he whistled as he walked around inspecting the work of his crew. He passed by my hiding spot and stopped. I held my breath. My heart was pounding in my ears. He grabbed me by the hair and dragged me out from behind the barrel. "There you are, Lady Casey. I've been looking for you. I wanted to speak with you for a moment." He brought me below deck to Monroe's study area. The table was soaked in blood. The books and papers had been swept onto the floor and were spattered with red. Some of Monroe's teeth were lying on the floor by my foot. I picked them up and put them in my pocket. I fought the urge to cry while Garrick watched my reaction to the carnage. "I told you to stay away from my son. He is not meant for you. His purpose is much greater. I have sworn to protect you, and I promised Lucia that no harm would come to you during your journey to Norg Hollow. After that, no one knows what to expect. For now, you are safe with me. Just leave my son alone." He left me there with the gore and Monroe's stained books and maps. I tried the door, but he had locked it behind him. I was trapped. My heart hammered in my chest, and I took a deep breath and tried not to panic. I turned back to the mess, pulled the cleanest book from the pile, and started to read. It was the large book from before, the one with the sending ceremony. I started at the beginning and became immediately engrossed. I read for hours without noticing the passage of time, or the click of the lock when Garrick thought I had been punished enough. I sat, oblivious to the foul mess surrounding me, absorbed in the history of the witches. The reading grew easier as I began to better understand the wizard language. Monroe had made notes in the margins, his thoughts while he read a passage or a question that he would look into later. I felt close to him, like he was at my side, explaining everything to me. Then he really was standing next to me. His face was still misshapen, but he had showered and changed his clothes. I jumped when he touched me. I had been so intent on the book that I hadn't heard him calling me. He tried to smile. It looked painful. I can't stay long, but I will meet you tonight, sometime after midnight, for the sending ceremony. Keep reading. I think you will find it very illuminating. Then he was gone. I read until the dinner bell reminded me that I had not eaten since early morning. My stomach growled, and I went up to join Monroe and Garrick.
Chapter 14. It was just after 2 when Monroe slipped into the room. I was waiting for him in the darkness. He held something glowing in his hands. Light shone from between his fingers. "What's that?" "Lights for the ceremony. I wish I could do more." "You shouldn't be here at all." His face was still swollen and purple. He had used magic to fix his arm, but his face was a mess. He tried to grin, but I could see it hurt him. There were large gaps where his teeth had once been. "That was nothing. He's done worse. He's backed off quite a bit. My powers are growing stronger, and I think he's afraid I'll beat him someday. You don't need to worry about Garrick." We set to work laying out Meloda's body and surrounding it with tiny dancing lights. The damage to her face looked different in this light. It looked less gruesome and almost beautiful in its own way. Monroe was emptying her pockets, something I had not been able to bring myself to do. I crept to his side, eager for some clue, something that would tell me about who she was in life and what kind of journey she had made. I wanted to know who had hurt her so terribly and left her to drift alone in the vast ocean. There were several things of interest in her pockets: a locket, a lock of hair, another bright shell from the beaches of Norg Hollow, and a blank parchment, much like the one I had been given in Lychee. Monroe collected everything into a small velvet pouch and passed it to me. As I put it in my pocket, my fingers brushed one of the jewels of Nakai. I was tempted to pull it out and see Monroe's reaction. If their powers were indeed as mighty as the books claimed, he would recognize them immediately. Any wizard would. I dismissed the idea and withdrew my hand from my pocket. Though I had instantly connected with Monroe, I did not know if I could trust him. I had to be certain before revealing such a coveted treasure. We finished the sending ceremony in silence, except for the final chant, which had to be done in a whisper for fear of Garrick hearing us. When it was over, Monroe helped me carry her body out to the open air. Her body was thin and light, and we lifted her above our heads, and were about to heave her into the icy water, when her body vanished in a puff of smoke and drifted away on the wind. I said a silent goodbye, while Monroe hurried to his room to study. I remained staring out at the sea for a long time. Garrick appeared a few hours later and stood quietly behind me. He looked out over the sea. "It is done, then. You have sent her body beyond." I nodded. "Good. This will make passage through the portal easier. Less magic to account for." He started to walk away. "We will be there by midday. Prepare yourself." He left without another word, and I slipped below to find Monroe. If Garrick saw, he ignored me and left us alone. Monroe was huddled over the table, wiping up the remains of the mess with a wet cloth that was already soaked in his blood. I paused, fearing to approach, but he heard me and turned to greet me with a smile that was both gruesome and heartwarming. "Come here. There is no reason to be afraid. My father has far more pressing matters on his mind today. He won't notice either of us until it is time to cross. Are you ready?" "I don't know. What am I supposed to do? No one ever told me what to do once I got this far." "They probably doubted you would ever reach the Panouche village. You're deceptive, Lady Casey. You are far more powerful than you seem." "Can you just call me Casey?" I was only trying to be respectful. That is how the Wizards of Greys addressed the witches back before Norg Hollow slipped away. But I will try to remember to be less formal when we are alone. As for what you are to do when we cross, no one is truly certain. It will be perilous. There are sure to be enemies waiting on either side of the portal to stop us, and you will be revealed for who you truly are. There will be no hiding it. The legends that predicted your return say that you carry a special tool, one with a very powerful magic that will guide our ship to Norg Hollow, no matter where it may be. Do you have such a thing?" I nodded, and Monroe looked satisfied. "Good. Keep it hidden. Tell no one what it is, not even me. You have a much better chance of survival if it is brought out only when you really need it."
He went back to his cleaning, and I slowly walked away. I returned to my room. The table had been removed, which gave me more space to spread out and read. I had almost finished the book Monroe gave me. I kept hoping it would reveal some clue about the jewels of Nakai and how to use them, but there was no mention of them at all. My mother's compass, hidden in the yellow gem, must be the magical tool Monroe spoke of. The ship must have something I could use to break the jewel open and retrieve it, but it would have to be done in secret. If we arrived at the portal at midday, there would be no cover of darkness for me. I would have to do something risky, something that could potentially reveal me too early. I looked out the window. The sea was calm and empty as far as I could see. There was no trace of a magic portal, and no enemies to be seen. The sun was high in the sky and the shadows at their smallest when I went to find Garrick. He stood looking out over the sea. In the distance, a dark mass was approaching, but it was too far away to see clearly. "What's that?" Garrick kept his eyes on the horizon. "Pirates." "Pirates? Seriously?" "The pirates of Pavora Cove, I would guess. They control these waters. They don't like trespassers and won't like that we're trying to cross over. They cannot know what you are. The pirates of Pavora Cove greatly dislike the witches." His expression was curious as he turned toward me. There was something about the pirates that he wasn't telling me. Malice and pain filled his eyes, and he turned his back to me. The sky was growing dark as a massive storm cloud gathered overhead. The wind began to blow hard, and our ship was tossed haphazardly amidst the giant waves. Garrett grabbed my arm and half-dragged me across the deck. The wind was overpowering, and several times my feet left the floor. I closed my eyes and clung to Garrick. No spells came to my lips this time. My mind was blank with paralyzing fear. Garrick told me to get below deck, throwing open the door and screaming over the howl of the wind and the deafening thunder. He held tight to the door until I was through, then moved away. The force of the wind slammed the door shut just inches from my face, and I jumped back, stumbled on the stairs, and crashed to the floor below. Monroe was immediately at my side. I lay in a heap at the foot of the stairs. My hands were scraped and bleeding, and my hair covered my eyes. "Are you all right?" His concerned gaze swept over me and silently assessed me for damages. "I'm fine," I said, but as I hurried to stand and brush the dirt from my dress, pain exploded behind my eyes and I saw stars. I sat down hard on the floor and grabbed my head. "Whoa, take it easy, Casey. You must have cut yourself. Your head's bleeding." He pushed back my hair and a shock went through me. I cried out. He helped me stand and led me to the study room, seating me in a chair near his desk. He took out a first aid kit and cleaned the cut. He pressed his fingers against it. The pain made me jump, and he spoke to it. A sudden heat washed over me, and I broke out in a sweat. I felt like I was going to be sick, but I could also feel the wound closing. He stepped back and smiled at me. "What did you do?" "Just sped up the healing process a little. It isn't very deep. You should be fine in a few minutes. The weather's getting bad. We must be close." "Is it always like this?" "Only near the portals. Time travel is tricky. There's bound to be a few complications." Garrick said there were pirates. Monroe cursed under his breath as he opened a nearby closet and started rifling through it. He pulled out a sword. The light gleamed on its deadly blade. He gripped it in one hand and grabbed his staff with the other. He turned to me. "Can you stand?" "I think so." I rose slowly to my feet. My vision darkened for a moment, and I waited. After a couple long, deep breaths, my sight returned, and I looked at Monroe. "I'm fine." "Bring my bag." He ran up the stairs and out into the storm. The wind howled and the door slammed shut. His backpack was on the floor next to the desk. I grabbed it and ran up the stairs. I paused at the door. From the other side, over the roar of the weather, I could hear shouting. Gruff, low voices cursed and raged to the music of ringing swords. Then I heard Monroe cry out, and I threw open the door. The pirates were upon us. They were a small group, but large and very strong. The crew fought them with clubs and knives in their bare hands. Garrick was above, holding his glowing staff aloft and keeping the darkness at bay. It had been just after noon when I first saw the pirates, but the sky was now black and ominous. I couldn't find Monroe, so I ran for the stern. He was there, battling with the biggest man I had ever seen. The man's face had been cut many times and stitched back together with clumsy fingers, leaving scars that pulled his skin tight. A fresh row of black stitches held together his left cheek, and they were crusted with dried blood. The battle was fierce, and I was surprised by Monroe's strength and skill. Their swords crashed against each other with a deafening sound. Their muscles bulged as they struggled against the strength of another. The pirate bellowed and threw Monroe against the rail. Monroe saw me, and as the pirate advanced toward him, he held out his hand. The bag in my hands began to vibrate, as if something was alive inside and fighting to get out. I unzipped it, and a silver sphere the size of a grapefruit sailed out of the bag and straight into Monroe's hand. The pirate froze. Monroe got slowly to his feet, holding the orb before him. "Vladimir Varvanesk, captain of the pirates of Pavora Cove. Surrender to me, and join our crew." The pirate stood motionless. His eyes were dark with hate. He spit on the ground before Monroe's feet. "No." Monroe shrugged and threw the ball onto the deck, where it burst into a flash of silver dust. The pirates vanished. I ran to Monroe and threw my arms around his neck. He grimaced as if I had hurt him, and I removed my arms. "Please don't touch me. My father may be a braggart, but he is not a liar. I will become a Deku of Greys, the highest level of wizardry, and to do so my body must be pure. I have to admit that until now there has been no temptation. Women in this world are so dull, and in the magic realm I have only been amongst my fellow wizards." He looked straight into my eyes. His face was only inches from mine. It was healing quickly, and he looked even more handsome than when I had first met him. "You are a temptation for me, Casey. It would be easier for me if we could keep our distance." I stepped back in surprise. I felt treacherous tears spring into my eyes, and I quickly lowered my gaze to the floor. I nodded my agreement as Garrick came running around the corner, followed by the rest of the crew who were not too injured to run. They crowded around Monroe, shaking his hand and slapping him on the back as they praised his quick thinking and superior telekinetic powers. I moved quietly away and walked the length of the ship. In front of us, the sky seemed to shimmer. I could feel the jewels in my pocket growing hot. I pulled out the yellow gem and held it aloft. It glowed brightly, but I could still see the shadow of the compass inside. I looked around. There was nothing sharp enough to cut the gem, and nothing large enough to smash it. It was growing very hot in my hand, making it painful to hold, but my fingers would not let go. Monroe came racing around the corner with his sword held high. I held the jewel above my head and watched him advance upon me. My hand trembled a little, but something in my heart told me not to fear him. He brought the sword down hard and split the gem in two. There was an explosion, and the halves of the jewel fell to the deck. I held the compass in my hand and clasped it close to me as the ship passed through the portal. We entered a thick mist, so dense that I could not see anyone around me. I felt a hand take mine, and Monroe was suddenly beside me. He smiled and squeezed my hand. His face kept drifting in and out of the fog, but each time he appeared, he was smiling. I could hear my heartbeat. It was louder than usual, with our other senses shrouded in the mist. I knew that Monroe must hear it, but he didn't speak. He just kept smiling. I began to hear a second heartbeat, a slightly different pattern that danced in and out of the rhythm of my own. Monroe took my other hand, and we stood looking at each other. That is how I spent my first time travel, looking into Monroe's brilliant eyes and listening to the song of our hearts beating. Monroe let go of my hands as the mists quickly faded. The ship was in a cool lagoon. The water was green and glittered in the sun. Huge trees lined the shore. Their massive roots reached far out into the water. Everything was dark and green, and the air was filled with the scent of an ancient forest. The crew lowered the anchor, and we took rowboats to the shore. I sat beside Garrick while Monroe rowed. He was silent, his face grim and sullen. Monroe did not look at his father, and only gave me a fleeting glance, before he lowered his head and concentrated on rowing. It was beautiful to watch him. He moved in one fluid motion that was both powerful and graceful. I could feel Garrick watching me. I tried to avert my gaze, but I struggled to keep my eyes off Monroe. Garrick cleared his throat and broke the tense silence. I turned to look at him. He seemed older. His hair was a little grayer, and his face was ashen and seemed to have a few more wrinkles. He coughed and grabbed his chest. I went to touch him, but Monroe stopped my hand with a quick shake of his head. Give him a minute. I watched in horror as he convulsed beside me. Spittle flew from the corner of his mouth and landed beside my foot, and I quickly tucked my foot under my skirt. Monroe did not stop rowing. He didn't look at his father. Several tense minutes passed, and then it was suddenly over. Garrick sat up. His face was aged and his hair was silver, but there was a light in his eyes. His skin was again brown and weathered, no longer the color of old ashes. What just happened? Garrick raised his hand and gestured to Monroe. He seemed very tired. Time travel breaks you down after a while. You're not supposed to cross from the magic realm. The worlds were supposed to be separate, but it is in our nature to seek ever further, even if it means destroying ourselves in the process. My father has crossed many times, and it has begun to take its toll. This last crossing was risky. Once more would surely kill him. It's lucky we found you when we did. He continued to row but fell silent. I had a million questions, but I held my tongue. Garrick was breathing heavily beside me, and it was a relief when we reached the tree line. I hopped out of the boat as soon as I could see the bottom and waded in. The bottom of the lagoon was sandy and soft beneath my feet. Both Monroe and Garrick looked surprised, but Monroe smiled while his father frowned. Where are we? This isn't Norg Hollow. Somehow, I just knew it wasn't. Garrick's voice was harsh, and he spoke slowly, as if he was choosing each word very carefully and bringing it forth from the depths of his mind. You are on the northern shore of Grays. This is the land of the wizards. Few women have been here before, and you should not be here at all. Not all wizards want the witches to return. There are more than a few of us who were spurned by witches in the past. I felt a knot in my stomach. Then why are we here? I looked to Monroe for an explanation, but Garrick continued. We need to pick up some supplies. We will need different equipment to survive here. Don't worry, we will not stay long. Everything was prepared long ago for this journey. We will leave before nightfall from the southern shore. He didn't speak again, and I sat on a nearby tree root while they hauled the boat onto the land. The sun was warm and quickly dried my dress. The lagoon was beautiful, but there was something definitely masculine about it. The presence of a woman was missing, and nothing seemed quite right. There was a darkness about the place. The shadowed places beneath the trees were just a little too menacing. I would have preferred to stay in the sun, but I knew that would not be possible. I was impatient to get started. If I had to leave the warmth and light and plunge myself into darkness and dank, I wanted to get it over with as soon as possible. The men hid the boat beneath a pile of dead tree branches, and it was finally time to go. Garrick led the way, and I followed. Monroe was close behind me. He turned often to look behind us. His eyes searched for any hint of danger. As soon as we crossed into the trees, we were instantly plunged into darkness. Sunlight did not reach past the outer edges of the forest, and the light under the trees was dim and green. The air was thick and humid, and I struggled to breathe. I cast one longing look back at the sunlit lagoon before following Garrick into the darkness. We plunged through the trees and underbrush without following a clear path. Garrick seemed to know the way and always picked the best places to walk without becoming ensnared in the tangled branches and weeds that stretched from tree to tree. We walked for several hours before Garrick halted. A huge flat rock wall stood before us. Garrick tossed down his staff and bag. I noticed that he no longer carried a sword. He sat down at the base of the wall and leaned against it. Monroe was still facing north, watchful and silent. Garrick motioned for me to sit. I must rest a little before we climb. The crossing has affected me far more than I expected. I hope I will have the strength to complete this journey. Monroe sat down near me, keeping his eyes steadily on his father. You will make it, father. If I have to, I will carry you. Garrick smiled and thanked his son, but his eyes were sad. He knew that he was not long for this world and had become a burden. I wanted to hug him when I saw his mournful expression, but I didn't dare. Monroe sensed my confusion. Unlike his father, he had grown stronger and more powerful when we crossed into the magical realm. He was becoming more confident in his powers, and there was something reassuring about his serious demeanor. It was easy to picture him as a powerful wizard, ruling over his people with wisdom and kindness. He smiled at the question I had not spoken aloud, and I again wondered if he could read my thoughts. We could use magic to get us there faster. Indeed, we could already be at the house picking up supplies, but it is dangerous to attract attention while you are with us. The fewer wizards that know of your existence, the better. Try to rest. The climb will be brutal. He smiled at Garrick, who had already drifted off, propped up against the mountain, and was snoring softly. I didn't want to sleep, but Monroe was watching me. I lay down and closed my eyes. I heard his stealthy step as he moved away to stand guard while we slept. The wind rustled the leaves above us. I found that I was exhausted, and soon drifted off to sleep.